Evan Malone was proud of the life he'd built in his late father's home. Nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the property was a testament to everything Evan valued: freedom, independence, and a deep connection to his past. His father had spent years restoring the house, making it a place of warmth and stability, and Evan had done everything he could to maintain that legacy. The sprawling front yard was his pride, meticulously maintained with lush grass, vibrant flower beds, and a small pathway that led to a detached garage. Inside the garage were Evan's prized possessions, a small but impressive collection of vintage cars that he had painstakingly restored over the years. It was his sanctuary, a world away from the pressures of his demanding job as a logistics manager. One unremarkable Tuesday evening, Evan came home later than usual after dealing with an endless stream of emails and phone calls. As he turned onto his street, a strange sense of unease crept over him. The familiar sight of his home didn't bring the usual comfort. Instead, his headlights illuminated something massive and completely out of place: a towering semi-truck parked squarely in the middle of his front yard. The truck's massive tires had torn deep ruts into the once pristine lawn, crushing several of the flower beds and leaving broken irrigation pipes spurting water into the air. It was as if his carefully maintained haven had been invaded by chaos. Evan slammed on the brakes and sat in stunned silence for a moment, staring at the scene before him. His first instinct was that it had to be a mistake. Perhaps the driver had been forced to stop here for an emergency? Maybe someone had accidentally given the wrong address? But the reality of the destruction before him quickly ruled out any harmless explanation. He threw open his car door and stormed toward the truck, his frustration mounting with each step. As he approached the vehicle, he noticed a paper taped to the windshield. The faint light from the nearby street lamp revealed scrawled handwriting across the page: permission granted by Karen Rivers. The name was vaguely familiar. Karen lived a few houses down, and Evan had only interacted with her briefly during a neighborhood barbecue. She had struck him as overly assertive and self-important, but he had never had any direct issues with her. That was about to change. Evan pulled out his phone and called the number listed on the side of the truck. After several rings, a gruff voice answered, "Yeah, who's this?" "This is Evan Malone. Your truck is parked in my front yard, destroying my property. You need to move it immediately," Evan said, trying to keep his anger in check. The driver sounded confused. "What? I was told this was a staging area for a neighborhood project. Some woman named Karen Rivers gave me the all clear, said she had the authority to use this space. You saying this ain't her property?" "Not even close," Evan snapped. "This is my house. I didn't authorize anything. You need to move this truck now." "Look, I'm just following orders, man. If you've got an issue, take it up with Karen," the driver said, clearly uninterested in the growing tension. Evan ended the call and stood there for a moment, his phone still clutched tightly in his hand. His frustration boiled over as he realized this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple phone call. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Marching back to his car, he grabbed his flashlight and began inspecting the damage. The sight only fueled his anger. Deep tire marks stretched across the yard, the flower beds were reduced to piles of crushed petals and soil, and one of his sprinkler heads had been completely obliterated. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a violation of his space, his work, and his pride. As Evan stood there seething, a familiar voice called out from behind him. "Oh, Evan, I was just about to come talk to you," Karen Rivers said, her tone overly cheerful. Evan turned to see her walking toward him. A smug smile plastered across her face. She was impeccably dressed, as though she had just stepped out of a corporate meeting, and carried an air of authority that immediately grated on his nerves. "What the hell is going on here?" Evan demanded, gesturing toward the truck. Karen's smile didn't falter. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Evan. This is all part of the neighborhood improvement project. We're working to bring some much-needed upgrades to the area, and your yard is a perfect temporary storage spot. It's just for a few days." Evan blinked in disbelief. "Temporary storage? On my property, without even asking me? Are you out of your mind?" Karen's expression hardened slightly, but she kept her tone patronizingly calm. Evan, you need to think about the bigger picture. This project benefits everyone, and as a member of this community, I assumed you'd want to contribute. Contribute? By letting you destroy my yard? I don't think so, Evan shot back. Move the truck, Karen, now. Karen sighed theatrically, as though Evan were an unruly child. I'm afraid it's not that simple. The truck is here as part of a city-approved plan, and moving it prematurely could jeopardize the entire timeline. Surely you don't want to be responsible for delaying progress. Evan clenched his fists, struggling to keep his temper in check. Karen, this is my property. You don't have the right to do this. Either you move the truck, or I will. Karen's smile returned, but it was colder now, tinged with a warning. I'd be careful if I were you, Evan. You might find that cooperating is in your best interest. Pushing back could make things complicated. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Evan standing in his ruined yard, stunned by the audacity of her threats. As he watched her disappear into the night, one thing became painfully clear: this wasn't just about a truck. It was about control. And Evan wasn't about to give up without a fight. Evan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Semitruck looming in his yard, a hulking monument to the chaos that had invaded his life. Karen's smug parting words echoed in his head, and the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. What gave her the right to use his property as though it were her own? The next morning, Evan resolved to take immediate action. He wasn't going to sit idly by while Karen bulldozed over his boundaries literally and figuratively. As the first rays of sunlight stretched across the horizon, Evan grabbed his phone and began making calls. His first attempt was to contact the city's zoning office. After navigating a labyrinth of automated menus, he was finally connected to a representative who sounded as though she was on her third cup of coffee. Evan explained the situation, emphasizing that he had not given permission for his yard to be used as a staging area for any kind of project. The woman on the other end of the line was sympathetic but firm. I'm sorry to hear about the damage to your property, Mr. Malone, but we don't have any record of an authorized project involving your address. If you'd like, I can file a formal complaint and escalate this to our compliance department. No record? Karen said this was a city-approved project. Evan pressed, his frustration growing. I can only speak to the records we have on file, the representative replied. If this was city-sanctioned, there would be permits, but I'm not seeing anything under your address or the name Karen Rivers. My advice is to document everything and consult with legal counsel if necessary. Evan hung up, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. If Karen had lied about the city's involvement, what else was she hiding? His next call was to his attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Stephanie, who had helped him with a property dispute years ago. After hearing Evan's account, Stephanie wasted no time laying out a plan. First, document everything. Photos, videos, written descriptions, get it all down. Second, you need to formally notify this Karen Rivers that she does not have permission to use your property. Send her a cease and desist letter. I'll draft one for you today. And third, don't engage with her directly. If she escalates, let me know immediately. By the time Evan hung up, the sun was fully up, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He grabbed his camera and began methodically documenting the damage. Deep tire ruts cut through his once pristine lawn, the sprinkler system was completely mangled, and several of his flower beds looked like they'd been hit by a bomb. He even climbed onto the truck's platform to inspect it more closely. To his surprise, he found stacks of construction materials, pipes, cement bags, and what looked like surveying equipment. This wasn't just some random parking job. Karen was clearly using his yard as part of a larger plan. As Evan climbed down, a low rumble caught his attention. He turned to see Karen striding toward him, her heels clicking against the pavement. She had an air of practiced calm, but there was something in her eyes that put Evan on edge. "Good morning, Evan," she called out cheerfully, as though they were old friends. "I see you're up bright and early. Isn't it a beautiful day?" "Karen, what the hell is going on here?" Evan demanded, motioning toward the truck. "I spoke to the city. They have no record of any project involving my property. Care to explain that?" Karen's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. Well, of course these things take time to process. The paperwork might not have made its way to their system yet, but rest assured, everything is above board. This is all for the betterment of the neighborhood. That's a load of crap, Evan shot back. You're trespassing, and you're destroying my property. I've already contacted my lawyer, and you'll be hearing from her soon. Karen's expression hardened. She crossed her arms and tilted her head, a calculating glint in her eyes. Evan, you're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. I'm trying to improve our community, and you're standing in the way. Do you really want to be that person? I want you off my property, Evan said firmly. Move the truck, take your materials, and don't come back. Karen let out a long, theatrical sigh. I see you're not interested in being reasonable. That's unfortunate. But I'm afraid the truck is staying where it is for now. It's already loaded with materials that can't be moved without disrupting the project timeline. Maybe if you'd been a little more cooperative, we could have avoided all this. Evan took a step closer, his voice low and steady. This is my land, Karen, not yours. Not the city's, mine. You're trespassing, and I'm giving you one last chance to fix this before it gets worse for you. Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. I'll take my chances, she said before turning on her heel and walking away. By mid-morning, Evan's attorney had sent the cease and desist letter via email and certified mail, and he felt a small sense of satisfaction knowing that he was taking the right steps to protect himself. But the situation only escalated from there. That afternoon, Evan noticed a group of workers arriving with more equipment. They unloaded additional materials and began setting up what looked like temporary fencing along the edge of his yard. One of the men, wearing a fluorescent vest, approached Evan. Sorry, sir, we're just following orders, the man said, holding up a clipboard. We've been contracted to secure the area for construction. Who contracted you? Evan demanded. MS Rivers, the man replied, glancing nervously at his clipboard. She said everything was approved. If there's a problem, you'll need to take it up with her. Evan couldn't believe what he was hearing. Not only was Karen refusing to back down, but she was doubling down on her efforts to claim his property. He snapped photos of the workers and their equipment, making sure to capture their faces and the license plates on their vehicles. As he watched them hammer stakes into his lawn, he felt a wave of anger and helplessness. It was one thing for Karen to make empty threats, but now she was actively destroying his property in broad daylight. That evening, Evan received a knock at his door. He opened it to find an envelope sitting on the welcome mat, with no sign of who had left it. Inside was a letter on official-looking stationery, claiming to represent a neighborhood improvement committee. The letter accused Evan of obstructing community progress and threatened legal action if he continued to interfere. It also included a list of supposed fines he would incur if he didn't comply with the committee's demands, fines totaling over $10,000. Evan's hands trembled as he read the letter. It was clear now that Karen wasn't acting alone. She had allies, and they were willing to go to great lengths to intimidate him. But Evan wasn't about to roll over and let them win. He scanned the letter and sent it to Stephanie, who called him almost immediately. This is serious, she said. These people are trying to bully you into submission. But don't worry, we'll fight this. The letter doesn't hold up legally, and the so-called committee has no actual authority. I'll draft a response tonight. As Evan hung up, he felt a mixture of relief and dread. He knew he had the law on his side, but that didn't make the situation any less overwhelming. Karen and her allies were playing a dirty game, and he had no idea how far they were willing to go. One thing was certain, though Evan wasn't backing down. Evan woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and a sense of dread that settled heavily in his chest. The sight of the Semitruck on his front lawn, now joined by temporary fencing and construction materials, was a daily reminder of how much his life had spiraled into chaos over the past few days. Karen's threats, the letter from the so-called Neighborhood Improvement Committee, and the damage to his property made it clear that this wasn't going to resolve itself easily. He had a battle on his hands, and Karen wasn't backing down. His first move was to follow Stephanie's advice, document everything. Evan spent the morning meticulously photographing every inch of the damage. The ruts in the grass were now deeper, with some areas of the lawn completely torn up by the workers' boots. The temporary fencing had been installed haphazardly, with sharp metal stakes driven into the soil just inches from his flower beds. Piles of cement bags and PVC pipes were scattered across the lawn, and the once serene view of his house now looked like a construction site. He even recorded a video of the semi-truck idling loudly, its diesel engine rumbling as if to mock him. Just as he finished his documentation, Evan noticed a group of neighbors gathering near the sidewalk. They stood in a loose circle, whispering among themselves and occasionally glancing in his direction. It didn't take long for Karen to appear, her presence unmistakable. She had the same confident stride and smug expression that had infuriated him the day before. This time she was carrying a clipboard and gesturing animatedly as she addressed the group. Evan couldn't make out her words, but it was clear she was spinning a narrative. The occasional gasps and nods from the neighbors made it clear that whatever Karen was saying, it was designed to vilify him. He felt a pang of frustration. Karen wasn't just trespassing on his property, she was actively turning the community against him. Deciding he'd had enough, Evan marched across the yard, his boots crunching on the damaged grass. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the murmur of the group. Karen turned to face him, her smile widening as though she'd been expecting him. "Oh, Evan, perfect timing. I was just explaining to our neighbors about the importance of this improvement project. Everyone here understands how much better our community will be once it's completed. It's such a shame that you're opposing progress." "Opposing progress," Evan said incredulously. "You mean standing up for my own property rights? You're trespassing, Karen. This is illegal, and you know it." Karen's smile didn't waver, but there was a dangerous edge to her tone when she replied. "Evan, I think it's clear to everyone here that you're being unreasonable. This project benefits everyone in the neighborhood, including you. You should be thanking me for bringing these improvements to our community." One of the neighbors, an older man with a cane, chimed in hesitantly. "Karen says this project will raise all our property values. Is that true?" Evan opened his mouth to respond, but Karen cut him off. "Absolutely. Once this is complete, the entire neighborhood will see a significant boost in property values. And let's not forget the aesthetic improvements. Evan's lawn is the perfect staging area, it's centrally located, and, well," she trailed off, giving a pointed look at the torn-up grass. It needed a bit of work anyway. Evan clenched his fists, barely able to contain his anger. "Don't listen to her. This isn't about property values or aesthetics. This is about her trying to take what doesn't belong to her. My property isn't part of this neighborhood committee or whatever she's calling it." Karen raised her clipboard and tapped it with a manicured nail. "Actually, Evan, that's where you're wrong. I have documentation proving that your property is within the jurisdiction of the committee. I'd be happy to share it with you, assuming you're willing to cooperate." "Save it," Evan snapped. "My lawyer's already handling this. You'll be hearing from her soon." Karen's smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Well, I suppose that's your choice. But I think you'll find that cooperation would make things a lot easier for everyone involved." The crowd began to disperse after that, but the damage was done. Evan could tell from the murmurs and hesitant glances that many of his neighbors had bought into Karen's narrative. It wasn't just his property under siege, it was his reputation. By midday, Evan noticed another unsettling development. Workers had begun unloading heavy machinery onto his lawn. A small excavator and several large pallets of materials now sat on the torn grass, and the noise of the equipment echoed through the neighborhood. Evan stormed outside and confronted the foreman, a burly man with a clipboard who seemed unfazed by Evan's anger. "You need to get this stuff off my property," Evan said, pointing at the machinery. "You're trespassing." The foreman didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Take it up with MS, Rivers. We're just doing what we're paid to do." Evan felt his blood boil. "You're destroying my lawn, my irrigation system, and my property value. This is illegal. If you don't move this equipment, I'm calling the police." The foreman shrugged. "Call whoever you want. I'm just here to do a job." Fuming, Evan walked back into the house and dialed the non-emergency police line. When the officer arrived, he listened patiently as Evan explained the situation and showed him the damage. The officer walked around the yard, taking notes, but when it came time to confront Karen, she played her part perfectly. "I have the documentation right here," she said sweetly, handing the officer a folder. "This project has been approved by the neighborhood committee. Mr. Malone is simply being difficult." The officer flipped through the documents, frowning. "I'm not seeing anything here that explicitly authorizes the use of Mr. Malone's property," he said. Karen sighed dramatically. "It's all part of the overarching improvement plan. I'm sure there's just been a misunderstanding. I'll make a note to clarify things with the committee." The officer turned to Evan. "I'm sorry, but without clear evidence of wrongdoing, there's not much I can do. This looks like a civil matter." Evan watched helplessly as the officer left and Karen's smirk returned. "Better luck next time, Evan," she said before walking away. That evening, Evan sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of documents, photos, and legal correspondence. He felt trapped, as though Karen had managed to twist the system against him. Despite his best efforts, the situation seemed to be escalating beyond his control. But as he stared at the mess of paperwork, a new determination took hold. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one. She might have manipulated the neighbors and skirted the law, but Evan wasn't about to roll over. He grabbed his phone and started making a new plan. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Evan's frustration had reached a boiling point. Karen's brazenness, the truck parked on his yard, and now the supposed neighborhood improvement committee pressuring him with fabricated fines. It was too much to ignore. His once pristine lawn was now unrecognizable, and the sight of the fencing stakes hammered into the ground made him feel like an intruder on his own property. Despite the assurances of his lawyer, Stephanie, that the letter held no legal weight, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's scheme was far more complex than it appeared. He knew that if he didn't act decisively, she would only escalate her actions. Stephanie advised him to remain calm and avoid direct confrontation, but Evan couldn't resist taking another step toward uncovering the truth. He decided to document everything in even greater detail, taking high-resolution photos of the damage, the truck, and the fencing. He also recorded every interaction he had with the workers who occasionally appeared on his property, most of whom claimed to be following instructions without offering any specifics. These workers avoided eye contact and were clearly uncomfortable, which only deepened Evan's suspicion that something larger was at play. Late one night, Evan noticed the sound of hushed voices outside. He turned off the lights inside his home and crept toward the window. Two men in dark clothing were inspecting the stakes driven into his yard. They appeared to be discussing something, their voices too low for him to make out, before one of them pointed toward the area near his garage. Evan's pulse quickened. He grabbed his flashlight and camera, then stepped outside. "Hey, what are you doing on my property?" he demanded. The men froze, startled by his sudden appearance. One of them, a stocky figure with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, muttered something under his breath before both turned and hurried toward a black SUV parked on the street. Evan raised his camera and snapped several photos as they drove off, the license plate barely visible in the dim light. When he inspected the area they had been standing in, he noticed something odd, a small, square device partially buried in the dirt next to one of the stakes. It had a blinking red light and appeared to be connected to a thin wire running underground. Evan carefully retrieved the device and took it inside. He had no idea what it was but knew it was significant. The following morning he called an acquaintance, Mark, who worked in electronics and occasionally consulted on construction projects. Mark arrived later that day, intrigued by Evan's description of the device. "This is a ground-penetrating scanner," Mark said after examining it. "It's used to detect underground structures, pipes, cables, even voids or storage tanks. These things aren't cheap, Evan. Whoever left this here is looking for something specific." Evan's stomach churned. Karen claimed this was for a neighborhood project, but what kind of project needs something like this? Mark frowned. "If they're using this on your property without permission, that's a huge red flag. Whatever they're after, it's not just about landscaping. You need to find out what's beneath your land." Evan's thoughts immediately turned to his late father. His dad had often mentioned that the area was once a construction zone decades ago, long before the neighborhood existed. There had been rumors about unused pipelines and even decommissioned storage tanks left behind during the expansion of the city. At the time, Evan had dismissed these stories as irrelevant, but now they seemed chillingly plausible. With Mark's help, Evan began researching the history of the land. Public records revealed that the area had indeed been part of an industrial project in the 1960s. Specifically, there had been a network of underground fuel pipelines and storage facilities that were later abandoned when the city rezoned the area for residential development. The records were sparse and incomplete, but they confirmed one crucial detail: his property sat directly over one of these long-forgotten zones. Evan's heart sank as the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. Karen wasn't just staging a petty neighborhood power play, she was likely after whatever valuable resource was buried beneath his land. Whether it was an intact storage tank or salvageable materials, it was clear that Karen and her so-called committee were willing to do whatever it took to claim it. The next day, Evan's lawyer, Stephanie, called with an update. She had received a response from Karen's team, which amounted to little more than a vague dismissal of Evan's complaints. However, the response included a surprising claim. Karen now alleged that a portion of Evan's property was under review for possible inclusion in a community redevelopment project. The implications were clear. She was attempting to argue that Evan's land didn't entirely belong to him. "This is a scare tactic," Stephanie assured him, though her tone revealed her own concern. "They're trying to exhaust you, Evan, but we can fight this. I'm filing an official challenge to their claims and will demand they produce documentation to back up their assertions." Evan nodded, though his frustration remained. "They're digging at night, Steph. They're planting equipment on my land and sneaking around. This isn't just legal maneuvering, they're up to something serious." "Then we'll make it even more serious," Stephanie said. "I'll escalate this to the city council and have them investigate the validity of their claims. In the meantime, keep documenting everything." Evan took her advice but also decided to take additional precautions. He installed more security cameras around his property, ensuring that every angle was covered. He also purchased motion-activated floodlights, which he placed near the garage and along the edges of his yard. If Karen's team tried anything else, they wouldn't do it unnoticed. Days later, Evan received another envelope on his doorstep. This time it was marked with the seal of a private real estate development firm. The letter inside informed him that his property had been identified as a site of interest for future urban development. It included a thinly veiled threat that if he refused to cooperate, he could face legal action for obstructing progress. Evan was livid. The letter made it clear that Karen wasn't acting alone. She was likely working with this development firm to seize control of his land. Determined to gather more evidence, Evan reached out to a trusted neighbor, Alice, who had lived in the area for decades and was known for her meticulous record-keeping. When he explained the situation, Alice agreed to help and provided him with old community newsletters and documents she had collected over the years. Among them, Evan found a newsletter mentioning Karen's involvement in a previous project that had resulted in several other homeowners selling their properties under dubious circumstances. It seemed Karen had a history of strong-arm tactics, always hiding behind the guise of community improvement. Evan shared this information with Stephanie, who began building a case against Karen and her associates. However, the pressure on Evan only intensified. Late one night, his floodlights activated, and the cameras captured several figures attempting to remove the stakes and the remaining fencing. Evan immediately called the police, but by the time they arrived, the intruders were gone. The police report noted the damage but offered little hope of immediate action. The situation had escalated beyond anything Evan could have imagined. What had started as an infuriating inconvenience had become a battle for his home, his rights, and his peace of mind. Yet even as the odds seemed stacked against him, Evan felt a renewed sense of resolve. Karen and her team might have resources and connections, but they had underestimated one thing: Evan's determination to protect what was his. He wouldn't stop until he exposed Karen's lies and ensured that she could never pull this kind of stunt again, not on his land, not on anyone's. Evan felt like his life was spiraling out of control. Despite his growing efforts to document Karen's actions and protect his property, her campaign against him only escalated. The once quiet sanctuary he called home now felt like a battlefield. Every day brought new surprises, more workers showing up unannounced, more materials dumped onto his lawn, and more threats thinly veiled as community notices. Karen wasn't backing down, and Evan realized she was pushing him to the brink, hoping he would either give up or make a mistake that would give her the upper hand. The first sign that things were getting worse came early one morning. Evan woke to the sound of grinding metal and loud voices outside. He looked out his window to see a crew with heavy equipment ripping up the edges of his property near the road. They were installing what appeared to be large pipes, and when Evan rushed outside to confront them, he was met with a wall of indifference. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" Evan shouted, his voice carrying over the cacophony of machinery. One of the workers, a lanky man in a reflective vest, barely looked up from his task. "We're laying groundwork for the redevelopment project," he said casually. "Just doing our job." "This is private property," Evan snapped. "I didn't authorize this, and you have no right to be here." The man shrugged. "Take it up with the project manager. We've got a permit." Evan's stomach dropped. "What permit?" "Show me." The worker smirked and gestured toward a clipboard resting on a nearby pile of materials. Evan snatched it up, scanning the document quickly. It was a generic-looking form full of vague language about community infrastructure improvements. There were no signatures, no official seals, just Karen's name printed at the bottom as the supposed project coordinator. "This isn't worth the paper it's printed on," Evan said, throwing the clipboard to the ground. "If you don't stop this right now, I'm calling the police." The worker raised his hands in mock surrender. "Go ahead. We're just following orders." Evan stormed back inside, furious. He immediately called Stephanie, who was equally alarmed. "They're getting bolder," she said. "If they're starting construction, it means they're trying to establish a precedent, basically. If they act like they have authority long enough, people might believe them. But this is still illegal. I'll file an injunction immediately to stop any further work." Later that day, Evan returned home from running errands to find another surprise waiting for him. Someone had spray-painted a large red X on his garage door, along with the words "Future Site." It was a blatant act of intimidation, and Evan knew exactly who was behind it. He checked his security footage, but whoever had done it had kept their face hidden under a hood. The footage showed them arriving in an unmarked white van and leaving within minutes. Evan reported the incident to the police, but they offered little help. "It's vandalism," the officer said with a shrug. "We'll file a report, but unless you catch them in the act or have better evidence, there's not much we can do." Frustrated but undeterred, Evan decided to fight fire with fire. He contacted a local environmental surveyor to inspect his property, hoping to find something that would definitively prove Karen's actions were illegal. The surveyor, a grizzled man named Doug with years of experience, spent hours walking the property, using specialized equipment to analyze the ground beneath the surface. By the end of the day, Doug's findings left Evan both shocked and furious. "There's definitely something here," Doug said, pointing to the area near Evan's garage. "Looks like an old underground tank, probably from when this area was industrial land. It could contain anything: oil, chemicals, maybe even something hazardous. If that's the case, you're dealing with a serious environmental issue." Evan felt a chill run down his spine. Could Karen know about this? Doug shrugged. "If she's been using ground-penetrating scanners, like you said, then yeah, she probably knows. And if she's working with developers, they might be looking to extract whatever's down there and flip the property for a massive profit." This revelation added a new layer to the already complicated situation. Karen wasn't just trying to seize his land out of spite. She had likely uncovered something valuable and was using every dirty trick in the book to get her hands on it. Evan shared Doug's findings with Stephanie, who immediately added it to their growing case file. Meanwhile, Karen's tactics became even more aggressive. A few nights later, Evan was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. He rushed downstairs to find one of his front windows broken, a brick lying on the floor surrounded by shards. Attached to the brick was a note written in bold, angry handwriting, "Get out while you can." Evan's blood boiled. He called the police again, but just like before, they seemed reluctant to take the situation seriously. Could be a random act of vandalism, the responding officer said. Do you have any enemies? Only one, Evan replied darkly. Karen, however, remained untouchable. She continued to act as though she was above the law, her smug demeanor never wavering. Evan knew she was counting on him to back down, to give up in the face of her relentless harassment. But he refused to play her game. Instead, he doubled down on his efforts to expose her. Through Stephanie, Evan requested an emergency hearing to address the trespassing and illegal construction on his property. In preparation, they gathered all the evidence. They had photos, videos, Doug's survey report, and the cease and desist letter that Karen had blatantly ignored. Evan also reached out to a local journalist he trusted, sharing his story in the hopes of shedding light on Karen's actions. The hearing date couldn't come soon enough, but Karen wasn't about to wait passively. On the eve of the hearing, Evan noticed several unmarked trucks pulling up to the edge of his property. Workers began unloading heavy equipment, including a massive drilling rig. Evan's heart raced as he realized what they were planning. They were going to start digging, hoping to uncover the tank before the court could intervene. Evan immediately called the police and demanded they stop the unauthorized excavation. To his relief, this time the police took action. The workers were forced to leave, and the equipment was impounded pending the outcome of the hearing. Karen, of course, denied any involvement, claiming the workers had misinterpreted her instructions. But the damage was done. Karen's desperation had exposed her true intentions, and Evan felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about his property anymore. It was about standing up to the corruption and greed that Karen represented. She had underestimated him, and now she was about to pay the price. The day of the hearing arrived, and Evan walked into the courthouse with a folder full of evidence and a renewed sense of purpose. Stephanie was by his side, calm and composed as always, her presence a reassuring counterbalance to the turmoil Evan had endured. Across the room, Karen sat flanked by two attorneys, her confidence unshaken. She shot Evan a cold, almost mocking smile that made his blood boil, but he forced himself to stay composed. Today wasn't just about standing his ground, it was about exposing Karen for what she truly was. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and an authoritative tone, opened the proceedings and allowed Stephanie to present their case. Stephanie began with a meticulous recounting of Karen's actions, the unauthorized use of Evan's property, the fabricated documents, the ongoing harassment, and the suspicious excavation attempts. She backed each claim with photographs, video footage, and sworn testimony from the environmental surveyor Doug. Your Honor, Stephanie said, her voice steady but firm, this is not a case of a simple property dispute. This is a calculated, illegal attempt to seize land through intimidation, fraud, and outright trespassing. Mr. Malone has endured weeks of harassment, financial strain, and damage to his property because MS Rivers believes she is above the law. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing at the evidence displayed on a monitor. The video of workers attempting to dig on Evan's land, coupled with the surveyor's report about the underground tank, seemed to catch her attention. She leaned forward, her expression sharp. MS Rivers, the judge said, turning to Karen, do you have an explanation for this? Karen's lead attorney, a polished man in an expensive suit, rose to speak. Your Honor, my client acted in good faith based on her understanding of the community's needs. The property in question has historical ties to redevelopment efforts. And my client believed she was working within her rights to improve the area. Any misunderstandings are regrettable but not malicious. The judge raised an eyebrow. And how do you explain the unauthorized excavation equipment and the lack of legitimate permits? The attorney hesitated, clearly unprepared for the question. Karen leaned over and whispered something in his ear, her calm demeanor faltering for the first time. The attorney cleared his throat. The equipment was brought in prematurely by a subcontractor. My client had no knowledge of their actions and immediately took steps to rectify the situation. Evan couldn't help but scoff quietly. It was a weak excuse, and the judge seemed unconvinced. Stephanie seized the opportunity to press harder. Your Honor, Stephanie said, we also have evidence that MS Rivers' actions are part of a larger scheme. she has ties to a private development firm that has been targeting properties in this neighborhood, particularly those suspected of containing valuable resources. This isn't about community improvement, it's about profit. She submitted emails and financial records that Evan and Stephanie had painstakingly gathered, showing Karen's correspondence with the development firm. One email in particular stood out. Karen had described Evan's property as a gold mine and assured her contacts that she could secure it by any means necessary. The courtroom fell silent as the email was displayed on the screen. Karen's face turned pale, and her attorneys scrambled to object, claiming the emails were taken out of context. But the damage was done. The judge tapped her gavel once to restore order and addressed Karen directly. Ness Rivers. The judge said, her voice stern, "It appears that you have not only overstepped your bounds but may have engaged in criminal activity. The evidence before me suggests a deliberate and illegal attempt to seize private property for personal gain. This court does not take such matters lightly." Karen opened her mouth to speak, but her attorney placed a hand on her arm, silencing her. The judge continued, her tone unyielding. "Effective immediately. All activities related to this so-called redevelopment project are to cease. Any further attempts to access Mr. Malone's property without explicit permission will result in severe legal consequences. Additionally, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for further investigation." The room buzzed with murmurs as Karen's composure finally cracked. Her face was flushed, and her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. Evan allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was regaining control of his life. As the hearing concluded, the judge granted Evan a restraining order against Karen and her associates. She also ordered Karen to compensate Evan for the damages to his property, including the cost of repairing his lawn, sprinkler system, and garage. The final blow came when the judge warned Karen that further misconduct would result in harsher penalties, including potential jail time. Outside the courthouse, Evan and Stephanie stood in the crisp afternoon air, watching as Karen and her legal team hastily left the building. Karen avoided meeting Evan's gaze, her once imposing presence reduced to a shadow of its former self. "You did it," Stephanie said, offering Evan a rare smile. "She's finished." Evan nodded, though he knew the fight wasn't completely over. The investigation into Karen's activities could take months, and the damage to his property would take time and effort to repair. But for now, he felt a sense of relief and triumph. He had stood his ground, fought back against someone who thought they could trample over his rights, and won. As he drove home, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. His yard was still a mess, and there was plenty of work to be done, but it no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like his home again, a place worth fighting for. The aftermath of the court hearing marked a turning point for Evan. For weeks, his life had been consumed by Karen's harassment, escalating schemes, and the relentless battle to protect his home. Now, with the judge's decision firmly in his favor and Karen's actions under criminal investigation, the storm had finally begun to pass. Yet, even as he stood in his yard surveying the damage, Evan knew that there was still work to be done physically, emotionally, and legally. The first order of business was reclaiming his property. Evan hired a landscaping crew to repair the deep ruts and broken irrigation lines left by the Semitruck. He spared no expense in restoring the lawn to its former glory, knowing that every blade of grass represented his victory over Karen's attempted takeover. The workers spent days digging out the stakes and fencing Karen's team had installed, while Evan supervised with a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in months. It was hard, sweaty work, but each step brought his home closer to normalcy. The neighborhood, too, had begun to change in Karen's absence. Once a polarizing figure who commanded a mix of fear and reluctant respect, Karen was now a pariah. News of the court decision spread quickly, and even her most loyal allies distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with her downfall. Some neighbors who had previously turned a blind eye to Karen's actions began reaching out to Evan, offering apologies for their silence and support for the road ahead. While Evan harbored no illusions about rebuilding friendships with everyone, he appreciated the small gestures and accepted them graciously. One afternoon, as Evan worked in his garage restoring one of his vintage cars, Alice, his elderly neighbor, stopped by. She brought a basket of baked goods and a stack of old newsletters she had found in her attic. "I thought these might be of interest to you," she said with a warm smile. "It's about time someone stood up to her. You've done the whole neighborhood a favor, you know." Evan thanked her and flipped through the newsletters after she left. They contained a history of Karen's self-serving projects over the years, failed attempts to rezone parts of the neighborhood, dubious fines she had levied against other homeowners, and even a few whispers of previous investigations into her conduct. It was a sobering reminder of how long Karen had been wielding her false authority unchecked, and how many others had suffered because of it. By the time the final repairs to his yard were completed, Evan felt like he had reclaimed not just his property but also his sense of peace. The bright green lawn stretched out like a fresh canvas, and the sound of sprinklers clicking to life filled him with quiet satisfaction. He decided to host a small gathering for the neighbors who had supported him, hoping to turn the page on the months of tension and conflict. The gathering was modest but meaningful. A handful of neighbors came by, some bringing food, others simply offering kind words. They stood in Evan's yard, admiring the restored landscaping and sharing stories about their experiences with Karen. For the first time in a long time, Evan felt a genuine connection to the people around him. The solidarity was a reminder that while Karen had sought to divide and dominate, she had ultimately failed to break the community. In the weeks that followed, the district attorney's office formally announced an investigation into Karen and her connections to the real estate development firm. The findings were damning. Karen had conspired with the firm to target properties like Evan's, using intimidation and fraudulent claims to gain control of valuable land. Charges were filed against her, and Evan took quiet satisfaction in knowing she would finally face the consequences of her actions. As Evan stood on his front porch one evening, watching the sunset cast golden light over his freshly restored yard, he reflected on everything he had endured. The fight had been exhausting, frustrating, and at times overwhelming, but it had also taught him the value of resilience. He had faced down someone who thought they could take everything from him and proven that he wasn't so easily defeated. His home, once the target of Karen's schemes, was now a symbol of his determination to stand his ground. Evan poured himself a glass of iced tea and sat down in his favorite chair on the porch, listening to the peaceful hum of the neighborhood around him. The battles were over, and the scars both on the land and in his mind were beginning to fade. His home was his again, and this time he knew no one would ever take it from him.